I froze as my wife sat across the table from a strange man at a couple's dinner. We were surrounded by old friends, fake smiles and glasses clinking under the yellow lights, when she simply crossed the room with the ease of someone with nothing to hide and sat down across from a stranger. I was on the other side, laughing at a joke I hadn't even fully heard. I only saw the way she smiled at him, a smile that had once been mine. I stood up slowly, as if in a trance. I walked between the tables, my heartbeat increasingly muffled by the sound of conversation and laughter around me. She saw me. And froze. The blood drained from her face, her hands curled in her lap, and for a second she looked like a teenager caught red-handed. He looked at me disdainfully, as if he didn't know or didn't care. I stopped in front of them. My gaze held no anger, only absolute weariness. I said only one sentence: I just want you to be happy with your choice. And then I turned and walked away, without looking back, leaving behind not only that dinner, but the life I'd built with her. When she got home and realized I was gone, it hit her. She'd let the man who dreamed of every detail of his life with her slip away, for someone she barely knew if she wanted to stay until the next weekend. And in that moment, alone, surrounded by the silence of our empty house, she began to understand what she'd done. Love is a daily choice. It's not about butterflies, it's not about clichés or promises. It's about waking up next to the same person and still wanting to know them more. It's about seeing the flaws, the irritating quirks, the old wounds, and still choosing to stay. But she didn't. She wanted to experience the new, the exciting, the sparkly but lasting. And while she was wrapped up in secrets, stolen smiles, and deleted messages, I cooked dinners, took care of details, wrote notes she no longer read. Betrayal doesn't begin in bed. It begins with disinterest, with silent contempt, with dry responses, with affection that becomes an obligation. And when I realized something was off, I didn't look for proof. I didn't install trackers, I didn't snoop on her phone. I just observed. The distancing. The excuses. The laughter that was easier for the phone than for me. The cancelled dinners. The eyes that no longer sparkled when they saw me. And I found myself erased, diminished, excluded from the life I helped build. Until that night. That damned night of the dinner. The most devastating thing wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the way it was done. Coldly. Indifferently. As if it didn't hurt, as if I were just another closed chapter. She underestimated me. She thought I would beg, that I would ask why, that I would diminish myself to understand. But I had already understood. I had been replaced, and not even for something better. Just for something new. She came home that night expecting to find me on the couch, expecting an argument, an outburst. But she found emptiness. I was already gone. No shouting. No letters. No notes. Just silence. The silence of someone who loved themselves too much to beg for someone who no longer saw value in me. And it was in that silence that the guilt screamed within her. She cried. I know. Because he called me dozens of times in the following days. Because he texted, emailed, tried to see me. She said it was a mistake, that she was confused, that it meant nothing. But it all meant everything. The man she was involved with was an illusion. Someone who took advantage of her weakness, her vanity, her neediness, her ego. And while she dealt with the remnants of a love that was never true, I rebuilt my peace. It wasn't easy. I cried. I blamed myself. I tried to understand where I went wrong. But time, that silent and cruel teacher, showed me that love isn't enough when the other person has already given up. She tried to win me back. She tried to use the same paths that once held me captive, the memories, the smell of our home, the songs, the places. But I was already a different person. The pain transformed me. Her absence showed me that I was whole before her, and that I could be whole again even after her. The love didn't die. It just stopped making sense to us both. And when she finally found me in person, months later, her eyes full of hope, and handed me a letter with all the words I'd waited so long to hear, everything became clear. I read every line. She spoke of longing, of regret, of shattered dreams. She apologized. She said she still loved me. That she wanted to try again. But when I finished reading, I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and silently handed the letter back. She looked at me, begging for a reaction. And I simply said, "I waited so long for this letter. Too bad it arrived too late." And I smiled. Not mockingly. But with peace. Peace in knowing that, finally, I no longer carried that pain. Peace in knowing she understood what she lost. Peace in not having become the kind of man who takes revenge. I had forgiven. But I hadn't forgotten. I had moved on. And by my side was someone who saw me, not as an option, but as a choice. Every day. She stood there. Still. Silent. Tears in her eyes, watching the man she loved leave again. But this time, forever. And I moved on. Because sometimes, the true victory isn't winning someone back. It's learning to stop wanting them. But what exactly led her to betray me? What made her throw herself into the arms of a stranger even though she had someone who loved her completely? What did that man represent to her? And how was it that, even though she regretted it, she had to watch my life blossom away from her? Something happened in the midst of all this, something she never imagined. Something that made her understand, cruelly and definitively, that not every mistake can be fixed. And that sometimes, loss is the only lesson capable of teaching what it truly means to love. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal. On the contrary, we believe that fidelity is the basis, respect is the rule, and love does not combine with lies. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry deep truths. The betrayal destroys, corrodes homes, ruins lives, and leaves scars that not even time can erase. Get ready to dive into intense narratives, full of emotion, twists and turns, and unforgettable lessons. Press play, and get ready to hear a shocking story. His name was Daniel. An ordinary man to those who passed him on the street, but extraordinary to those privileged enough to get to know him calmly. There was something in his eyes, perhaps the firmness with which he faced the world or the delicacy with which he observed those he loved, that made anyone lower their tone and pay attention. He was the kind of man who didn't shout to be noticed. His presence was subtle yet striking. Intelligent, kind, dedicated, he was never one to throw himself into random loves or fleeting passions. He always believed in love as a daily construction, like a house built little by little, with bricks of patience, respect, silence, and presence. He was an architect, and perhaps that's why he saw beauty in details imperceptible to others, the way someone absent-mindedly fixed their hair, the way they smiled while reading a message, the pause between one word and the next when someone said, "I love you." He was an observer of the world, but above all, a builder of affection. Her name was Laura. Intelligent, sensitive, charismatic. She had one of those beauties that didn't scream, but hypnotized. Her dark eyes held an entire universe, and many questions. Laura was a journalist, passionate about stories, people, and discovering what hid behind their masks. Since she was little, she collected notebooks filled with notes about other people's lives, always wanting to understand, feel, and live through their stories. Perhaps that's why she was enchanted by Daniel from their first conversations. He was unlike anything she'd ever known. There was a calmness about him that disarmed her. He didn't need to win her over with grand gestures, he did that in silence. They met in a cafe, the kind that seemed straight out of a movie, low lighting, the smell of ground coffee, jazz music in the background, small tables, and the discreet clink of cups. He was reading a book on contemporary architecture, she was taking notes for a story about the impact of urban spaces on people's mental health. They exchanged unhurried glances. A wave here, a smile there, until fate, or the habit of always returning to the same places, brought them together once more. They talked about art, the fear of aging, silly dreams and grand ambitions. And when she told him she'd always imagined living somewhere where she could see the sunset from the window, he replied with a twinkle in his eye, "I build places like that." The phrase stuck in her head for weeks. The connection grew naturally. There were no rushes. Just encounters that became routine, messages that turned into affection, and a staycation that turned into, "Shall we live together?" Lara, with her natural restlessness, found a kind of harbor in Daniel. And he, with his stability, discovered in her the unexpectedness needed to break out of his automatic mode. They weren't perfect, they argued over trivial matters, had different ways of dealing with frustrations, and sometimes fell silent when they should have. But there was love. So much love. The kind that isn't expressed just with words, but with glances in traffic, holding hands amidst chaos, simple dinners prepared with love on bad days. The apartment where they lived reflected both of them, books everywhere, meticulously tended plants, paintings with hand-picked quotes. The kitchen was their favorite spot, where they laughed, teased each other, and made plans. Daniel had built a small hanging shelf just for Lara's notebooks, and she, in turn, had created a mural with photos of his architectural projects. Every corner of the house had a little bit of both of them, and that was what made it so special. Close friends saw them as a model couple. They were partners in everything. They went to events together, helped each other with professional decisions, and had a habit of traveling once a year to a new place, where they could disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. They were accomplices. There was a silent intimacy between them that only exists when two people give themselves completely. Despite this, like all couples, they went through difficult times. There was a period when Lara's work required constant travel, interviews abroad, and overtime that made her more absent. Daniel, for his part, immersed himself in an ambitious project that consumed his weekends. The distance began to seep into the little things, the coffees they no longer shared in the morning, the messages they responded to late, the nights they slept facing opposite sides. But even so, they fought. They met during breaks, exchanged notes left on the table, and tried to rekindle the rituals that kept them close. Daniel believed it was all a phase. That love doesn't die overnight. That fatigue isn't synonymous with disinterest. He wasn't naive, he simply insisted on seeing the bright side, what could still be saved. Lara, on the other hand, sometimes lost herself in her own thoughts. She wondered if she was still the same woman Daniel had fallen in love with. If she still made him happy. She felt pressured from all sides, at work, in family expectations, in the silent demands she imposed on herself. And, like so many people, she began to confuse fatigue with lack of love. Even so, there was tenderness. Daniel still made her coffee exactly how she liked it. She still straightened his coat in the morning before leaving. There were still kisses, albeit quicker. There were still hugs, even if tired. But there were also silences that hadn't existed before. Small noises that grew louder over time. An event was coming up, a couple's dinner organized by mutual friends, the kind where everyone gathered to celebrate time, achievements, and reunions. Daniel suggested they go, even though he knew she might be tired. Lara hesitated, but accepted. And in the days leading up to that dinner, she seemed more distant than ever. He tried to get closer, asked about her day, made jokes, brought flowers for no reason, but she smiled with half her face, and with the other half seemed to be elsewhere. Still, he persisted. Because that was what he knew how to do, care, wait, endure. That night, he chose a shirt she always said she liked. She wore a dress he'd bought on one of his trips. In the car, they exchanged few words. In the elevator, there was a long silence. But upon entering the ballroom, they were greeted with warm hugs and toasts. They were surrounded by happy people, sharing stories, and memories. It was supposed to be a light evening. A good night. And for a while, it even seemed like it would be. She smiled more than usual. She chatted enthusiastically with her friends. And he watched her, feeling a pang of relief. Perhaps they were reuniting there, in this familiar setting. Perhaps there was still time. But something about that smile sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. It was as if he wasn't included in her joy. As if she were celebrating something that didn't involve them both. He didn't know what it was yet. I didn't know what was coming. I just felt it. Like someone who hears the beginning of a storm in the distance, even when the sky is still clear. Like someone who senses something is about to change forever, even without any evidence. It was the kind of silence that precedes the abyss. That night, amidst drinks, glances, and loose words, fate began to weave the threads of a story that would change everything. Daniel, still believing in the possibility of reconstruction, smiled tenderly. And Lara, torn between what she had and what she thought she was seeking, walked a fine line between desire and doubt. But what exactly was being born in that silence? What had she felt outside that made her lose herself? And how far can someone move away from the one they love without realizing they're already too far gone? Everything still seemed whole, but the first shards were already forming. The morning after dinner, Daniel woke up alone. Lara had left early, texting him that she had something to take care of at the office and would later meet a friend for lunch. He lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, the space beside his bed feeling too cold for a Sunday. He got up slowly, making her coffee out of habit, even though he knew she wouldn't be there to drink it. A small, almost invisible, yet painful detail. This was how their estrangement manifested itself now, no longer in fights or arguments, but in subtle absence, in the silent routine he still insisted on maintaining as if it were a ritual of faith. Time passed slowly that day. Daniel went to his office, reviewed blueprints, and typed a few emails. He tried to focus on the project he was working on, but his mind kept wandering to places he'd avoided. When she got home, it was after 5. Her face was tired, her eyes downcast, and a hurried kiss on his cheek. She said she needed a shower and then had an article to finish. He just nodded, watching as she disappeared down the hallway, sensing something there, something he couldn't quite reach, but already touching everything around him. The following days were a series of absences disguised as commitments. Lara spent more time away, always sorting something out, under tight deadlines, buried in meetings. Sometimes she left before he woke up, sometimes she returned after he fell asleep. And even when they were in the same room, it seemed like an invisible curtain between them. Daniel slowly began to notice that her eyes avoided his. That her touch was less frequent. That her cell phone was turned face down or hurriedly put away when he approached. He wasn't paranoid. Never had been. But he wasn't blind either. He tried not to confront her. He preferred to observe, to feel. Because he still wanted to believe it was just a phase, that everything would work itself out. But silently, Daniel began searching for answers. He began noticing the schedules, the details. The different scents on her coat, the mood swings, the laughter on the phone that stopped when he entered the room. And then came the empty excuses. The last-minute interview. The meeting with a friend who's going through a divorce. The company event that was rescheduled. That Friday, Lara left, saying she was going to cover an exhibition downtown. Daniel stayed home, supposedly finishing a project. But a restlessness consumed him, something greater than he could control. Without planning, he left. He got in his car, drove aimlessly, until he parked a few blocks from the place she usually frequented with her coworkers. And he waited. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, nor what he would do if he found it. He simply followed the impulse of someone who could no longer bear the doubt gnawing at him. It didn't take long. He watched as she got out of a black car, wearing a dress he hadn't seen in ages. She wasn't alone. A man got out on the other side. Elegant, confident. They didn't touch, but there was something between them that oozed intimacy. They walked side by side to a fancy restaurant, the kind he and Lara frequented on their anniversary. Daniel didn't follow them. He didn't need to. That image said enough. He stood there, standing, his hands on the steering wheel, his heart like a concrete block in his chest. She returned home without shedding a tear. Not out of coldness, but because the shock was too great to allow any reaction. When she arrived hours later, he was in his room, pretending to be asleep. She entered slowly, changed in the bathroom, and lay down on the bed as if nothing had happened. He smelled a perfume that wasn't hers. Or maybe it was, but used differently. He also felt the weight of the lie on her breath. And then he understood something that hurt more than any confirmation: she was no longer his. The end didn't come in the form of shouting or confrontation. It came as a gradual emptying. Over the next few days, Daniel began to withdraw. Little by little, he stopped waiting for messages. He stopped making coffee. He stopped trying to force conversations. He began sleeping later and later, avoiding being home, not asking where she was going or when she was coming back. And Lara noticed. She felt the change, but couldn't name it. Not clearly. And it bothered her. He began to be kinder, as if trying to make up for something. He sent messages with emojis he hadn't used in a long time. He brought him desserts he liked. But it all seemed rehearsed. Everything was a soulless gesture. And he silently began to pack away his belongings, his books, his paintings. Not for revenge, but for survival. He was breaking from the inside out, preparing for his final absence. Until the invitation arrived, the couple's dinner. The same one they had attended months earlier as one of the most admired couples among their friends. A new gathering, with close friends, old laughter, and memories that still hurt. Lara hesitated to accept, but Daniel said they would go. Not with anger, but with a serenity that left her disconcerted. That night, she got ready in a hurry. She seemed restless. He, on the other hand, was calm. He dressed as usual, straightened his collar in the mirror, and stared at his reflection with an old weariness. In the car, silence enveloped them again. But this time, there was something definitive about it. In the dining room, amidst the hugs and smiles, they seemed like just another couple. They pretended well. Conversations flowed, toasts were made, but something hovered between them. An emptiness disguised as routine. A goodbye about to happen. Daniel remained discreet, observant. Lara, on the other hand, seemed more restless. She walked from table to table, chatting with friends, avoiding his gaze. Until, at a certain point, he saw her cross the room. As if in slow motion. And sit at the table of a stranger. It wasn't a greeting, it wasn't a coincidence. It was intimacy camouflaged as chance. Daniel watched. The way she smiled. The way the other man looked at her. There was no doubt. Only confirmation. He got up from the table without making a fuss. He walked with firm but calm steps. When he reached them, she saw him. And froze. His eyes wide, his smile evaporating, the glass trembling in his hand. He simply stopped before them, stared at the man for a second, then looked at her with the calm of someone who had cried all they had. He said a single sentence, low, firm, without rancor. "I just want you to be happy with your choice." And he turned. He walked out of the room without looking back. Lara stood there, paralyzed, listening to the whispers around her, trying to control the trembling in her hands, feeling her heart sink into silence. She couldn't move for minutes. The man in front of her seemed uncomfortable, looking away, as if he'd suddenly realized he wasn't part of this story, just a consequence. When Lara arrived home that night, the first thing she noticed was the silence. A different silence. Daniel wasn't there. There were no lights on, no smell of the nighttime coffee he sometimes made. No keys on the counter. No sound coming from the bedroom. She called his name once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. She opened the closet doors. Half the clothes were gone. The desk was missing the notebooks. In the bathroom, his space was empty. She sat on the edge of the bed and only then began to understand. He was gone. Without a fuss. Without shouting. Without asking why. He just left. And in that moment, with her chest tight and her hands cold, she began to relive it all. Every gesture of his that you ignored. Every detail you took for granted. Every silence you pretended not to hear. And she began to realize that, perhaps, she was truly alone. For the first time. But I didn't yet know that what came next would completely unravel her. There was something she didn't know. Something that would change her perception of everything. A truth about to come to light. A revelation that would give that story a weight she never imagined it would carry. Lara spent the next few days as if walking through rubble. Daniel's absence filled every room, every silence. She carried on with her routine automatically, but inside, something was slowly unraveling. Every corner of the house brought back memories, every daily gesture reminded her of the way he looked at her, of the little things that once seemed trivial and now felt like torture. She tried texting, calling, even going to his old office, but they had already told her he'd taken a leave of absence and was traveling for an indefinite period. She didn't know where he was, who he was with, or what he felt. She didn't know if he felt anything. And it suffocated her. At first, she tried to convince herself that he needed time. That he would come back, that she would have a chance to explain, to tell him it was all just a moment of confusion. She reread old messages, tried to remember the last, "I love you," she'd said out loud, and suddenly, everything she'd ignored for months came flooding back, the care he'd shown even when she no longer cared, the touches she'd rejected, the invitations she'd declined, the looks she'd pretended not to see. The guilt began to take shape. She hadn't just betrayed him, she'd silently diminished him. She'd traded an entire love for something she couldn't even tell was desire or need. As the weeks passed, the man she'd become involved with also began to act differently. The messages became more sparse, the meetings cold. And one afternoon, he came right out and said, "You complicated my life. It wasn't supposed to be like this. You know I never promised anything." She felt it like a punch in the gut. She was alone. Truly alone. And in the midst of that emptiness, a single certainty grew: she needed to apologize. Not because she expected to be accepted back, but because she understood what she'd lost. It wasn't just Daniel, it was what he represented. The security of a love that didn't need to be begged for, the loyalty of someone who knew how to stay even when things were difficult. After weeks of silence, she got a clue as to where he might be. A mutual friend mentioned he was participating in a social project rebuilding schools in underprivileged communities, something he'd always talked about doing but never found the time. It was a small, remote town, surrounded by mountains and valleys. Lara didn't think twice. She got in her car, drove for hours, mentally retracing every detail of their story. She carried a handwritten letter with her, containing everything she'd never said. It wasn't an attempt to get back together, just a last-ditch attempt at redemption. She arrived on a gray afternoon, with the sky heavy. She asked for him in houses and businesses, until someone pointed out a school under renovation on top of a hill. She climbed the trail with sweaty hands, her heart pounding. When she saw him from afar, hammering on a wooden structure with other volunteers, she felt a lump form in her throat. He seemed different. Lighter, firmer. A man at peace with his own absence. She waited outside until he saw her. For a moment, their eyes met. And there was no anger, no surprise. Just something that seemed to have been accepted long before that reunion. He approached calmly, wiping his hands on his paint-stained pants. He stood before her as if he already knew what was coming. Lara handed him the letter. She said she needed him to read it. That it was important. Daniel said nothing. He sat on a nearby wooden bench, opened the envelope, and began to read. She stood before him, motionless. Her words spoke of regret, of emotional blindness, of guilt. She admitted every mistake, detailed the phases of their relationship, how she lost herself and each other. In the end, she said she hoped only for forgiveness. Not a fresh start, but the right to sleep one day without carrying the weight of having destroyed such a true love. He finished reading in silence. He folded the letter carefully, as if guarding something delicate. He looked up at her. And then he said he had waited for those words. That he read each line as if recognizing the pieces of himself left behind. He said he forgave her. Sincerely. Because he had held grudges for a long time, but then he understood that continuing to hold that grudge inside him was to remain trapped in something that no longer existed. She cried. She tried to control herself, but her eyes would no longer obey. It was then that Lara asked if he was alone. If there was anyone. She wanted to know, even if it hurt. And he hesitated for a second. Then he smiled, a slight smile, and said yes. That there was someone. And that he hadn't expected this. He met her right there, at the project. A woman who looked at him without knowing his story, without expectations, without a shadow of comparison. Someone who saw him whole, even without knowing his wounded parts. Someone who didn't inherit the weight of the past, but built a new chance with it. And in that moment, something inside Lara shattered irreversibly. She wanted to smile, wanted to say she was happy for him. But the words wouldn't come. Because in that moment, she brutally understood what it meant to truly lose someone. She tried to hide her pain, but he could see it. He approached, touched her shoulder, and said, in a firm voice, that she had been part of shaping who he was now. And that for that, there would always be respect. But there was no longer room for the two of them. She nodded. And thanked him. She said that only now did she understand the magnitude of what they had been through. And that she truly hoped he would be happy. Before leaving, she turned around one last time. He was already back at work, laughing at something a colleague had said. And she saw him smile with the same brightness as before, but for someone else. And there, in that piercing silence, the final penny dropped. That same night, already at home, alone in a room now too big for so much regret, she opened her phone. A new notification. A post. It was a photo. Daniel and his wife beside a child. Small, with curly hair. And the caption, "We are reborn when we love without fear. Thank you for giving me the chance to start over." Lara swallowed hard. She'd never known the child existed. She'd never imagined he'd be experiencing something so intense, so real. The last piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. He'd moved on. He had a new life. A new family. And now, the only thing left for her was silence. The silence of someone who understood too late. The way back seemed longer than the way there, even though it was the same. Lara drove in silence, her eyes fixed on the road, but her mind was in disarray, as if someone had opened all the drawers of her memory at once. She couldn't measure what hurt more, having lost Daniel, or seeing him rebuilt in another life, smiling again, not as someone wounded who had overcome, but as a whole man, reborn, with purpose, with someone who completed him without needing to heal. The tires cut through the wet asphalt, and she barely noticed the light rain that was beginning to fall. She could still smell the paint in the air, the children's voices in the background, the sound of the hammer echoing like a cruel reminder that time had passed without her. And no matter how hard she tried to understand, she could only blame herself. Not only for what she had done, but for not appreciating it when she still could. For having had to lose everything to understand the value of the little things, the gestures, the silences that now screamed in her absence. Unsure of where to go, she didn't go home. She stopped at a simple roadside hotel, booked a room, and stared at the ceiling, her body tired and her eyes burning. Everything about her weighed heavily. She turned on her phone and stared at the photo again. The girl was smiling, her two front teeth missing, her arms around Daniel and his new wife. There was no dramatic caption, no indirect language. Just love, genuine, pure. She felt a lump rise in her throat, and even trying to be strong, she couldn't hold back the tears that escaped silently. It was as if everything inside her had broken. The loss, the regret, the echo of his words, "There is no more room for us." It sounded like a verdict. Irrevocable. And she knew it was. There was no room for recovery, no room for repair. No room for a fresh start. The next morning, she woke up with a swollen face and a tiredness that came not from her body, but from her soul. She got in her car and drove to his mother's house. A firm woman with watchful eyes, she had always treated her with respect. She rang the doorbell and was greeted with some astonishment. And before she could say anything, the woman greeted her with a quick hug and a deep look. They sat on the sofa, the same one she'd had on so many previous visits. Laura tried to speak, but she stammered between sobs. Daniel's mother listened in silence, her fingers clasped in her lap. When Laura finished, she simply said, "You no longer belong in this story." The words were not harsh, but truthful. Without cruelty, simply realism. She added, "He cried a lot, but he decided to live. And no one has the right to take that away from him again." Laura thanked him and left. With each step, she felt as if she were burying the last illusions she'd carried. There was no going back. No part of that old life fit her anymore. She sat in the car, looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time, saw herself as she was, a woman alone, marked by the choices she'd made. And there was no escaping it. Weeks passed. She returned to work, immersed herself in reporting, in the noise of the newsrooms, trying to silence her mind. She began writing a personal column as a way to purge the pain, without naming names, but describing feelings, losses, and emotional failures. The text went viral and gained readers. People who identified with the feeling of regret, with the sensation of having let slip what was most pure. It was her way of telling the world what she could no longer tell it. And even with the recognition that began to come, there was no satisfaction. It was as if everything she achieved now had a bitter taste, as if nothing could replace what she had lost. She tried to go out, to meet other people. Someone approached her, they tried to talk. But her gaze was always elsewhere. There was no room for anyone. Everything was still about him, even though he was no longer hers. Daniel, for his part, didn't look back. He kept the promise he'd made to himself when he decided to leave, to never let the past return to mess up what he'd built with so much effort. The woman by his side was different in every way. She didn't ask for proof, didn't demand gestures. She accepted him as he was, without carrying old expectations, without old wounds to heal. And he, now, was lighter. No longer the man who walked in silence, trying to salvage a relationship that had already ended. Now, he was someone who walked alongside, who learned daily about affection without fear. And the girl, his new partner's daughter, became a bond that brought him even closer to the idea of family. She called him Dan, with the naturalness of someone who felt love. And he reciprocated as if he were born for it. He didn't need blood ties to be a father. He just needed surrender. The new life wasn't perfect. It had its challenges, its reality checks. But there was truth. And that was what he had learned to value. The loyalty in her eyes. The commitment not through words, but through actions. He never spoke ill of Laura to anyone. When asked, he simply said that some stories end, even if the feelings don't disappear completely. He never undid the past. He simply understood he could no longer carry it. At a benefit for the project he was participating in, he was invited to give a talk about rebuilding. Not just physical spaces, but also self-rebuilding. He took the stage and spoke in a firm but emotional voice, "We are not obligated to stay with someone who doesn't choose to stay. But we are responsible for not abandoning ourselves in the name of a love that no longer sees us." Rebuilding hurts. But being stuck in what no longer exists destroys. The audience gave a standing ovation. And she, Lara, was watching the entire thing via a live stream. She hadn't heard about the event, having stumbled upon the link by chance on social media. He watched it all with teary eyes, murmuring the words along with him. Each sentence was a blow. But also a liberation. For the first time, she accepted that she needed to move on. He closed his laptop, took a deep breath, and looked around. The apartment was intact, but it wasn't another home. It was a place of memories. He decided he would change. I would start from scratch, in a different neighborhood, in a different space. She wanted, somehow, to give herself the chance to begin a new story. And even if she never found a love like the one she lost, she at least wanted to become someone who wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. Starting over doesn't erase what's been done. But it's the only way to avoid losing yourself completely. On the last Sunday of that month, while Daniel and his new family were picnicking in the countryside, the girl lay on his lap and asked if it was true that flowers grow stronger when they're pruned. He smiled and replied, "Not always. Some bloom even after they've been nearly destroyed. They don't grow because of the pruning. They grow in spite of it." And she, somewhere else in the city, planted her first seeds in a small pot on the windowsill of a new apartment. Without Daniel. Without promises. Only with the desire to be someone better than she was. Because understanding the pain she caused is a step. But it will never, ever be greater than the weight of knowing it was already too late. The new apartment was just over 50 meters, bare, with the walls still bare, but for Lara, that space was more than square footage, it was an act of renunciation. Not just of the house where she had lived with Daniel, but of everything that old life represented. She had said goodbye to what was, what could have been, and what would never be again. It was the kind of new beginning no one celebrates, because it's not motivated by hope, but by necessity. Living in that house, surrounded by memories that insisted on screaming every time she touched an object, became unbearable. So she packed up everything physical and left behind the intangible, but which still weighed like a brick on her back. In the new space, she decided to bring almost nothing with history. She bought basic furniture, changed the wall colors, and planted 2 violets in the window, small, fragile, as she felt, but with the potential to flourish if watered consistently. The weeks that followed were silent. Work filled her days, but the nights still carried the sound of absence. She had slept alone before, but now it was different. It wasn't the absence of a body beside her, it was the absence of a future. A future she knew well, one she had felt with her own hands, and which now belonged to someone else. Daniel wasn't part of her conversations, not even the ones she had quietly with herself. But he was there, woven into every decision, every gesture of self-care, every attempt at rebuilding. Love hadn't disappeared. It had simply ceased to be hope and become a memory. On a cold Friday afternoon, Lara was invited to speak at a literature event about the relationship between emotions and writing. She had published a series of chronicles about loss, and her name was beginning to circulate in circles she hadn't previously frequented. She took the stage with sweaty hands, a heavy heart, but with her head held high. She spoke about how pain is the raw material for moving stories, and how unresolved feelings eventually transform into characters and narratives. When she finished, she received enthusiastic applause. A gentleman in the audience approached her afterward, praised her writing, and said something that stuck with her: "It's beautiful to see someone transform destruction into art. But I just hope you're also rebuilding yourself, not just writing about it." That hit her hard. She realized there was still a gap between what she showed the world and what she truly felt. Writing was a relief, yes. But it wasn't healing. There were still too many open wounds for that. On the other side of the story, Daniel lived almost the opposite way. His days were filled with purpose, his projects kept him moving, and his new relationship blossomed serenely. The girl's presence in his life made him lighter, more spontaneous, as if there was something magical in being a role model for someone so pure. He didn't need to prove anything. There was no pressure, no fear of comparison. It was a pure love, lived in freedom and mutual respect. Still, there were inevitable moments of silence, when his mind would return to unanswered questions. Not because he wanted answers, but because the questions were part of who he had become. It was during dinner, at a small restaurant where they used to go as a couple and now frequented with his new partner and her daughter, that something struck him. The girl asked to go to the bathroom alone. When she returned, she was holding a paper flower given to her by a woman sitting at another table. It was Laura. She was there, unexpectedly, alone, thinner, more sober, with the eyes of someone who had gone through an internal winter. Daniel saw her. She saw him. And time stood still for a moment. She simply smiled slightly and got up, leaving the restaurant without saying a word. Not out of cowardice, but out of respect. She knew she no longer had the right to occupy that space. The scene remained etched in his memory for days, but he didn't mention it at home. Not because there was anything to hide, but because he didn't want an accidental encounter with the past to disrupt what was now the present. Another week passed until Laura, driven by a feeling difficult to explain, decided to write one last letter. Not to ask for anything. Not to provoke. Just to give back. She wanted him to know she was trying to be a better person, even if it no longer had any practical effect on his life. She wrote honestly, saying she would never look for him again, that she wanted him to be happy with the woman by his side, and that she was grateful for everything she had learned. The letter was delivered by Daniel's former office secretary, who still kept in touch with them both. When he read it, he felt something different. It wasn't pain, nor longing, nor compassion. It was a legitimate ending. For the first time, he felt she understood what had been destroyed. And that perhaps, now, she understood what it truly meant to love. Months passed. The seasons changed. And with them, so did the characters in this story. Laura continued writing, began a new personal project, and became involved in social initiatives supporting emotionally distraught women. She used her pain to guide others who, like her, had lost themselves. She no longer sought love. She sought purpose. And she discovered that sometimes, rebuilding yourself is much more difficult than finding someone new. But much more valuable, too. Daniel was invited to speak at a seminar on architecture and social impact. He took the stage, confident, and among so many technical topics, he made a point of mentioning something that came from within: nothing I've built with my hands would have value if I hadn't first learned to rebuild my heart. The projects that surround me are important, but the internal projects, the ones no one sees, are the most difficult and the most transformative. He received a standing ovation from an emotional audience. At the end, he received hugs and handshakes, and among those present, discreetly in the background, someone watched in silence. Laura had gone. She sat in the last row. She didn't look for him afterward. She just listened. And then she left. He knew that would be his last goodbye. The most sincere. The most silent. That same night, now home, she turned on the lights in the new room, picked up a book, sat on the edge of the bed, and gazed at the vase of violets. The flowers were growing. Slowly. But steadily. And in that moment, she understood that, despite everything, she was too. There was no more guilt, no self-deception, no hope of what would never come. Only her. And that, as hard as it was enough. Meanwhile, in a house not far away, Daniel was putting his daughter to bed. She asked for a story. He made one up, as he always did. But in the end, he said a phrase that echoed in the silent room: every story has a turning point. And sometimes, the turning point is discovering that the end doesn't have to be where everything ends, but where everything begins again. They both followed their paths. Parallel. Distinct. And even without knowing it, they walked under the same sky. Now, finally ready for the next chapter, each in the book they chose to write. Time continued its course, indifferent to the marks it left on those who had loved so intensely. Lara no longer marked her days with memories, but she still felt, in certain quiet moments of her routine, the weight of everything that had been. Her mornings became lighter, her work more mature, her writing more profound. She had transformed, not into a new person, but into a more sincere version of the woman she once was. In that new apartment, now with its own colors, new paintings on the walls, and plants growing with silent strength, Lara had discovered a way to exist without seeking approval, without comparing herself to the past. There were still memories, of course, some hidden in drawers, others imprinted in her writing, but they were no longer shackles, they were records of a difficult but necessary road. It was in her words that the old feeling found relief, and through them that she touched other lives, without pretensions, without vanity, only with the raw truth she now knew how to carry. One drizzly afternoon, Lara was asked to write a special feature on families formed outside of traditional norms. It was a long-term project, involving interviews, travel, and the chance to reconnect with realities that, in some way, would help her understand more of what she had experienced. Among the families nominated for the article, there was one whose name immediately sparked something: Daniel. The suggestion came from a preschool teacher who had read her articles and thought the architect and his new family would illustrate the power of starting over. It took her days to decide whether or not to proceed with the interview. She didn't know if he would accept, nor if it was right to re-embrace something that could reopen wounds that were finally healing. But there was something greater than curiosity. It was as if life, with its subtle irony, was offering her one last chance to see it all through new eyes. She sent a formal email, identifying herself as a reporter, without resorting to their experiences. She asked if he would be willing to share his story with the project. The response came 2 days later, objective, polite, and without any sign of discomfort. He accepted. She scheduled the interview for a week later, at the community center where he volunteered. There was no emotion in his response, nor was there any openness to side conversations. It was, once again, him showing that he knew how to separate what was from what is. And she respected that. On the appointed day, Lara arrived early. The place was simple, with children playing in the courtyard, staff organizing materials, and walls covered in colorful drawings. She was sitting in a reading room, tape recorder in hand, waiting when he entered. He was dressed casually, with slightly longer hair and the same steady gaze. For a moment, the world around her went silent. She stood, extended her hand, and he shook it firmly, without hesitation, without exaggerated distance. Just civility. They sat across from each other. She thanked him for having her. He simply nodded, with a brief smile. The interview began with technical questions about the project, the architectural decisions, and the challenges of volunteering. He answered naturally, without evading, but keeping the conversation within professional boundaries. Lara listened attentively, admiring the clarity with which he spoke about construction, about space, about giving structure to lives that needed solid ground. When the conversation naturally veered into the personal, she was careful. She asked how the transition from his old life to his current one had been, how he met his partner, what it was like building a family with a child who wasn't his own. He answered sincerely, saying it was like finding shelter after a storm. He said he learned to love again slowly, that he needed to trust in time, that it wasn't about forgetting, but about not holding on. And when she asked if he harbored resentment from the past, he was silent for a few seconds before saying, "No. Because if I carried that, I'd be dragging a chain through everything I experienced today. And it wouldn't be fair to the people around me. Or to me." There was a moment when the silence between them stretched. She lowered her eyes, as if his words were a mirror. And then she said something that wasn't scripted, that wasn't on paper, but that escaped like a sigh: "You've built something beautiful, Daniel. And even if I'm not a part of it, it's beautiful to know that you've blossomed." He looked at her for a moment, and there was a mix of sadness and acceptance in his gaze. He simply replied, "Sometimes, we need to lose everything to discover that we can blossom in another way." It wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. And she felt it. Before leaving, he thanked her for the interview, for the respectful way she'd conducted everything. She thanked him back, and as she left, she found the girl playing in the hallway with other children. On impulse, she bent down and complimented the colorful drawing she'd made on the paper. The child smiled, not knowing who she was, just seeing a kind adult. It was a simple portrait, a house with a garden and 3 figures, a woman, a man, and a child. Lara felt a lump rise in her throat, but she smiled. It wasn't her place, and she knew it. But now she could look at it without pain. Only with respect. In the following days, he wrote the article with the care of someone he once loved. He omitted nothing, didn't romanticize, but didn't distort either. He let the words speak for themselves. In the end, he felt strangely free. It was as if, by writing about him as a reporter, I had stopped writing about him as a memory. The same week the article was published, she received a message from him. Short. Just saying he'd read it, that he found it respectful, and that he hoped she was doing well too. She replied that she was trying. And for the first time, he felt that maybe she really was. One day, while sorting through old papers, she found a yellowed envelope with photos she'd saved before moving. It was a sequence of images of travels, of spontaneous laughter, of a love that was no longer hers. She looked at each one for a moment, then returned it to the envelope and put it in the back of the drawer. Not as someone who denies the past, but as someone who finally understands that some memories belong only to what was. And that it's okay to leave them where they are. In Daniel's life, things also took on a new tone. He remained involved in social projects, made plans with his partner, and occasionally saw Lara's chronicles circulating online. He read with curiosity, sometimes with admiration, and at others with a slight pang. He knew some of those words had their origins in their experiences. But he didn't let himself delve deeper than necessary. He knew the weight of returning too much to what had already happened. He knew the risk of opening wounds that had finally healed. One night, while walking with her companion, she asked if he still felt something. Not jealousy, but honesty. He took a while to answer. Then he said, I feel respect. Because you don't build something like this and then erase it. But this is no longer part of me. It's part of the road. And I've moved on. She simply held his hand tighter, and they continued on in silence. Both had understood something that so many take a lifetime to grasp: love doesn't guarantee permanence. And forgiveness, however painful, is sometimes the greatest gesture of freedom one can offer and receive. Not to return, but to move on. The pain of loss teaches, but it is the decision not to repeat it that transforms. Now, with the path stabilized and new lives definitively blossoming, a final curve loomed ahead. Something neither of them expected, but which would bring the story to a conclusion marked not by reunion, nor revenge, nor gratuitous redemption. But by something even rarer, maturity. And by a final gesture that would clearly show that some stories don't end with a scream, but in the silence of those who learned, lost, and finally knew how to let go. A few months after the interview, the article Lara had written was nominated for a National Journalism Award. The recognition came as a surprise, not because of its merit, which she knew she had put forth sincere effort, but because that piece, more than any other, was the most intimate she had ever written. And not because it exposed past events, but because it conveyed feelings she had previously been unable to organize. The nomination brought her visibility, invitations, interviews, and a full schedule of events she would never have dared to attend before. She said it was the power of writing, but deep down she knew it was also the result of well-worked pain. That pain that was finally giving way to something different. Not euphoric happiness, but serenity. Not easy self-forgiveness, but emotional responsibility. And among the people who congratulated her, who said her words had touched them, many said they had learned to recognize the signs, to value what they had at home, to not repeat the mistake of disregarding sincere love. She listened to each of these confessions as if pierced by fine needles, but she was grateful. She knew that if what she had experienced could at least prevent others from destroying their own bonds, then perhaps it had not all been in vain. Daniel, on the other hand, was in the process of expanding his social architecture project. He had been invited to join an international consortium bringing sustainable solutions to vulnerable regions. It was an opportunity he'd always dreamed of, but now, with a new family, it involved more complex decisions. He talked at length with his partner, weighing the pros and cons, and together they came to the conclusion that they should go. It was a new country, a new culture, a chance to start over on a new level, taking her daughter along as an official part of the family. The excited girl drew pictures of the new house she imagined having there and asked him every day about the new country. Her mother, confident, made it clear that she would only embark because she knew the man beside her was loyal. And that was all she needed. They had already made plans, put the house up for sale, finalized contracts, and said goodbye to friends when, a week before the trip, an anonymous envelope arrived at Daniel's door. Inside was a single photo. A picture of the couple's dinner, captured by one of the photographers hired for the event. In the image, Lara sat at the table with the other man, and in the background, Daniel walked toward them. The exact moment of change. The end of the past. No message. No signature. But he knew. It wasn't a provocation, nor a warning. It was a reminder. Someone had decided he needed to see, one last time, the snapshot of the moment everything changed. And he stared at the photo for a few seconds, then folded it and put it away in a box where he kept mementos from another time. He said nothing to his partner. Not out of omission, but because he understood that image no longer held power over him. It was a record. That was it. The night of the awards ceremony arrived, and Lara attended alone. She wore a discreet dark blue dress, her hair tied in a simple bun. When her name was announced as the winner, she walked firmly onto the stage. She didn't smile with euphoria, only with gratitude. She took the microphone and took a deep breath. The audience was waiting for a technical speech, a thank you, but she began with a sentence that silenced the room: no one loses the love of their life overnight. We endure the loss in silence, one gesture at a time, until the other has nowhere left to go. She continued by saying that writing that article forced her to face herself, that the text was about him, but also about her, and above all, about what one learns when everything is already undone. She said that if there's one thing worth preserving in any story, it's respect. Because when respect dies, love has no place left to live. She received a standing ovation. But not for her writing. For her courage. The next morning, she left an envelope with the coordinator of the social center where Daniel worked before leaving. Inside was a letter with no goodbyes, no promises, just a handwritten note: thank you for being my home, even if only for a while. May you continue to be a shelter wherever you are. And that was it. She closed the doors to the past with firm hands, dry eyes, and a lucidity only those who have experienced their own downfall know. She didn't know he had already left the country. She had no idea he was starting a new life on another continent. But she didn't need to know. Because now, finally, his story no longer influenced the course of hers. In their new city, Daniel and his new family lived the first few months with that sweet mix of fear and discovery. Their daughter grew, the new school enchanted them, and weekends were spent in unfamiliar parks, markets filled with new smells, streets with different languages. His partner found work at a local publishing house, and he gradually adapted his projects to local demands. Sometimes, he would read articles in the press from his home country and see Lara's name mentioned as a reference in emotional chronicles. A faint smile would play at the corner of his mouth. It was well-deserved recognition. But that was it. There was never any contact, no attempt at rapprochement. Not because there was a lack of empathy, but because the page had long since been turned. Years passed. The girl grew up. Life went on. Lara also found new affections. Nothing intense or definitive. But enough to stop her from feeling marginalized. She learned to share her life without dependence, to offer love without expecting an immediate return. She had true friends, loyal readers, a full schedule, but a heart that was now more cautious, more honest with herself. Sometimes she was invited to speak about emotional fidelity, and she would say matter-of-factly, "I betrayed the one who loved me most. And I lost everything. That's why today I know how to recognize the value of every bond." It wasn't a confession, it was a warning. Many left her talks in silence, moved, reflecting on how much they despised the simple gestures that keep a love alive. One spring morning, she received a letter. Handwritten, in childlike handwriting. It was from the girl. Daniel's current daughter. The girl explained that she had read a book by Lara by chance in the school library, recognized the author's name, and wanted to thank her. She said that her mother and Daniel had never spoken ill of her. That she knew, somehow, that Lara was part of the love story that helped shape the father she had today. And, at the end, she said, "Thank you for making him feel, even though it hurt. He's the best father in the world. And he's only that way because he's felt so much." Lara cried. Not with sadness. But with relief. For the first time, she felt the cycle was finally over. And this is where this story ends. No fairy tale endings. No forced reconciliations. No revenge. Just with each character where they deserve to be. He, loving truly, caring for a new family, and being a role model for a new generation. She, learning to love herself again, to look at herself honestly, and to teach other women that betrayal, besides hurting the other, also destroys the perpetrator. And the girl, growing up between two adults who, despite their scars, chose to move on without harboring hatred. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments below, we'd love to hear from you. If you were moved or learned something from this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories like this. This narrative is a powerful reminder that betrayal destroys not only couples, but entire futures. It breaks trust, shatters plans, turns promises to ashes, and leaves scars that even time cannot completely erase. A second's error can cost years of true love. And in the end, the cheater almost always loses himself. Remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal here. We advocate clean love, mutual respect, and relationships based on truth. Until the next story.